me start over. So hello class. Today we're going to be learning about period 6, or we're going to be finishing period 6 and learning more about period 7. Period 7 is a very interesting, I guess, period or like couple of years, because it's really when we see the U.S. develop into the world power we see the U.S. is today. So finish 6. Okay, so period 6, we're going to go on to urban reform and the start of the progressive era. So we kind of left off on this. So I guess a really important person that y'all will probably learn about maybe in high school, United States history, or just in the future, is named Jacob Riis. He wrote the book How the Other Half Lives. This book really, depicts many of the immigrants or like the new immigrant families living in poverty, living in tenements, where there wasn't a lot of obviously room or just resources for them to live a clean or healthy life. He also included a lot of pictures of families in poverty, them crammed in tenements. There's a lack of sanitation. So these pictures and his book would go on to promote a sense of urgency and a sense of activism that sparked the spirit of progressivism, which we'll talk about more. Stuff that I included are how his pictures led to a call for reforms for sewers, garbage collection, and indoor plumbing. These are two pictures that Jacob Riis is really, really known for. And these two famous pictures of, immigrant families or just poor American families, crammed in an apartment. We also have another person, Jane Addams. She's very important as she was kind of the founder, or she started the settlement house movement. I'll explain more into that. In 1889, Addams rented what is called the Hull House, which was basically an old mansion in Chicago. The neighborhood around the Hull House was one of like the poorest, I guess, communities in Chicago. So Addams, provided healthcare aid, day nurseries for many working mothers, and adult education courses. So she would teach many of these immigrant families or these poor American families English, and many learned how to be literate. They, learned certain customs and just how to interact with like other people as well. So Jane Addams, because of the Hull House, she soon started this movement where, women, many which were from middle class to upper class families, taught poor immigrant workers. It's supposed to be poor immigrant workers. They, because of them, volunteering to kind of like teach these immigrants, and also providing healthcare aid and also nurseries and also education courses, women gained a lot of organizational and leadership skills that, transcended their original role as mothers. The last time we talked about women, we talked about how during the Civil War, they kind of took the places of men that went to the war. So they learned, a lot of skills. So this is just kind of, an advancing of positions of women that were once used to be how they were only mothers that only needed to stay home or take care of the children. This advanced kind of their position. This is an example of the settlement homes. This is actually, I believe, the Hull House that Jane Addams kind of rented or bought. This is an image of kind of like these nurseries or like the education services that Addams provided for children. We also have a change in kind of the culture because, we talked about in our last class, the Industrial Revolution, right? We talked about how the Second Industrial Revolution was really important because it developed a lot of these advancements in technology. So while developing these advancements, the Industrial Revolution also created a new middle class, right? Because the Industrial Revolution provided a lot of jobs and a lot of open employment spots for a lot of Americans. So now there was this creation of this new middle class where people now had leisure time on the weekends to have fun, to just go out and celebrate with or hang out with their family. The advancements in technology also allowed them to have more entertainment during this time. So we have the creation of department stores. I think everyone knows like what Macy's is. So like Macy's was developed during a time, a really huge department store in New York City. Marshall Field in Chicago. Basically, due to Industrial Revolution, it really revolutionized like urban shopping and what it means to shop while also like having this big floor of just supplies, materials just offered. We also have the emergence of spectator sports. I think everyone knows like football really emerged in campus life. A lot of colleges still have their football team, and it becomes like a national sport. We also have baseball. The Cincinnati Red Stockings was actually the first ever sports team to be supplied with an income. That's like a very interesting fact to know. We also have this changes in newspapers. So what was once very old, dull pages that are just black and white or gray, now changed to these colorful, big blocks of words with comics, sensational stories, which basically like exaggerated stories that are meant to catch the attention of the reader. Joseph Pulitzer was, kind of the one who kind of transformed those dull pages to beautiful, colorful pages. And we also have a lot of advertisements, which adds on to this like kind of new consumer culture and this new culture of like having money to spend during your leisure time, or just having money to spend in general. Someone asks, are newspapers colorful today? Well, I guess they are. I mean, they're very different from what was back then, which were only like black, white, gray. I think we have a lot more magazines, and since like the internet provides a lot of our news stories, there's obviously more color. Sophie, you have a question?
Yes, who is Joseph Pulitzer?
Joseph Pulitzer. So I put him here as he transformed, the dull pages of the New York World into.
So he was like an artist?
Kind of. He was also a writer. He was also a head of any news publications. You might know him from like the Pulitzer Prize, which is gifted to writers that write, books or just like passages that are like really nice and really beautiful. You should search him up. You might know him from the Pulitzer Prize. Yeah. So Maya or Mia said he modernized newspapers, magazines, sort of. Yeah, that's what he did. We also have a changes in art and literature. So we talked about how late 19th century early 19th century there was the use of romanticism, right? Romanticism, like romanticizing nature, or how the American West was a very beautiful, vast land. So because of the Second Industrial Revolution, and because of these reformers or this new progressive spirit that shine light on the dark places or just the harsh realities of cities, of urbanization, there's this change from romanticism to realism. So if you look on the right here, it's a painting that obviously depicts the city, depicts just the vast amount of like diversity seen in the city. We see these technological advancements in the back of, we talked about skyscrapers that happened, or these new taller buildings that were created due to the Second Industrial Revolution. So we see that, and we also see a lot of advertisements, that improvement in consumer culture, and we see tons of people in this city. So realism artists and authors focused a lot on the city, especially New York City. That was a really big, I guess, subject. There was also this development of what is called the ash can artists. So the ash can artists, they portrayed a lot of like the working class, New York City, obviously the dark alleys and then tenants and tenements. I have examples in the next slide. So these are two paintings, both painted in the kind of ash can realistic style, depicting, you know, certain communities within the city. And we obviously is very different from what the paintings we saw regarding like romanticism and that theme, because they were very focused on nature. Hannah asks, what does romanticizing mean? Well, the romanticism kind of art movement was very focused on how beautiful, how kind of majestic nature was. Now, obviously, this is very different, right? Sophie pointed out that this looks very busy. Yeah, so we see this, you know, a very busy kind of painting that's very largely different from what we saw, like the empty land or the empty plains we saw last time. Okay, so that ends period 6, that age of, you know, a lot of industrialization happening, you know, a lot of entrepreneurs. We're going to move on to period 7, lasting from 1890 to 1945. First, we're going to talk about, you know, the expansion of this progressive spirit. So we talked about before, Jane Addams and Jacob Rives, you know, they started this, you know, progressive spirit, or, you know, this spirit that many Americans believe that, you know, there need to be reforms made to reduce poverty or reduce, you know, certain health issues and concerns. So we're going to start period 7 off talking about the populist revolt. This technically wasn't really a revolt. It was kind of like, you know, certain groups of people coming together and saying that, you know, the current US government isn't doing enough to protect us as citizens. And so they made a party. So we're going to talk about the causes of this populist revolt and the birth of the Populist Party. So the causes: American farmers were overproducing crops. And obviously when you overproduce crops, it means that since there is such a large supply, the prices of certain crops begins to fall, right? Many of these farmers blamed railroads for the high prices they charged to transport crops, materials, because we know at this time, because of the Industrial Revolution, and because of, you know, the key entrepreneurs we talked about, you know, like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, or like other entrepreneurs like those who had a lot of power in monopolies, who had created monopolies, they would spike up the railroad prices or the prices for transportation. So farmers would have to pay more to transport their crops, or pay more to have like technology, like rakes or like certain stuff you need for farming to be transported to them. So obviously, you know, if you're not gaining enough money from, you know, these crops, and you're spending more money on actually getting seeds or like transporting the crops, you're, you know, making less money. So this caused a lot of farmers to borrow more money, which made them more in debt, because if you borrow more money, there's obviously interest rates applied in that. And many farmers who were indebted or who were in debt actually believed that, you know, that the gold standard for money. So during this time, money had what was called, like, it matched the gold standard. So it so it's like a short explanation of it. So money during this time was decided on, you know, how much gold America had, or because America would actively seek gold in exchange for the price of their currency, right? So farmers during this time believed that if they reduce the supply of, especially reduce the supply of money, many farmers believe that the gold standard reduced the supply of money and limited economic activity. And they believe that, you know, it's changing from gold to silver, which is less, right? You need less to, I guess, drill or there's more available, more silver supply would bring back the money and lead to inflation. So they believe that obviously, if you change from a gold standard to a silver standard, which is more plentiful and is more available to more people, this would mean that there's more money available. And if there's more money available, this would increase, the prices of crops, which then farmers would make money from the increased prices. So this kind of like these needs and these causes soon led to the birth of the Populist Party. So I put the word here, agrarian descent. I think we talked about agrarian before. It just means, relating to farmers, relating to agriculture workers. So this agrarian descent led to the Populist Party. Although, many of these grievances started from, farmers, this Populist Party also included, women's rights activists, labor leaders, and socialists. All of them demanded the government to basically have more control over the railroads and change to a free, unlimited supply of silver. So we talked about before how the government had this kind of like laissez-faire policy where they didn't really touch, the economy, or they didn't really, implement harsh policies to regulate the economy because, they believe that, what the economy is or what they're doing is fine. People or states or certain communities can like take care of themselves. They also they also had a lot of policies that we saw many labor unions have, where they endorsed an 8-hour workday and a graduated income tax, which basically means that if you earn more money, you get taxed more. And this is obviously, a debate that is still relevant today. So in the election of 1896, Republicans chose William McKinley. They nominated William McKinley. Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan. And the Populist Party was faced with a difficult choice because William Jennings Bryan supported this free silver policy that would help, that would help people in debt and that would help devalue money. So, this free silver policy was a main kind of policy for the Populist Party. So they chose to support Bryan because if they were to nominate another person, this would probably split the votes. And there's probably lessen the chance of the Democrats or William Jennings Bryan winning. However, McKinley won both the popular vote and electoral vote, so he became president. This led to a collapse of the Populist Party, and the silver issue also melted away because America found new gold mines or gold spikes in South Africa, Yukon, and Australia. The crop failure in Europe, and soon we'll learn more about, the start of World War I, led to an increase in American grain exports. So farmers were still, producing the right amount of crops to gain some profit. But however, it is also important to know that many farmers were still in debt, and these and like railroad companies during this time would still, mark up their prices. We would also see the what is called like from while there was like a collapse of the Populist Party, it would some of these like ideals like the 8-hour workday or demanding the government to have more control of railroads or a graduate income tax would soon, go over, and the Progressive Party or progressives would actually use those to, use those in their party or like as one of their causes or grievances. So we have kind of, well, the one on the left is a political cartoon. It shows this idea of like, well, obviously the cross is gold, so that shows like the gold standard and how like some people were like heavily relying on the gold standard, which is really, really bad, because many farmers, as I said before, I believe that this led to a lot of, disparity and poverty. On the right, we have I would say like a poster that's promoted William Jennings Bryan as president, as he would help lead to equal rights to all and no special privileges to anyone. So we have a change from populism to progressivism. So the Populist Party, since it collapsed, it came to a rise of what is called progressive sentiments, we learned before, but also a progressive party. So these same reform sentiments aided in the progressive movement and era. So in this kind of progressive era, these more condensed progressive movement cities were obviously the main focus, as they showed the direct result of industrialization and urbanization. Many progressives wanted to build a more just, fair, and democratic society. As I mentioned before, many also rejected the laissez-faire policy, and they wanted the government to take a more active role in their lives. There was also this emphasis on how citizens can create a more just society through reducing poverty and electing honest statesmen that would actually help their cause. And we also have what is called the rise of muckrakers. So muckrakers were like journalists or publications or just people that exposed, the corruptness of certain entrepreneurs, or exposed how certain captains of industry were taking advantage of smaller businesses, really exploiting certain businesses, how they created monopolies, how they created trust. We also have women in the progressive era and women in the progressive reform. The emphasis on women was huge during the progressive era, because we talked about before, how women, after slavery abolished, they felt disillusioned. They thought that they too would receive certain rights that the government, or that certain states granted to African Americans. So women during this time expanded their roles as mothers to also include activism and improving their community. We talked about the expansion of settlement houses from Jane Addams, so that obviously led to more leadership skills. We also have women's clubs that were really, really big, as more than 1 million women belonged to a club. And these clubs were basically kind of like small, I would say like small governments, or like small local governments, or just like a small community where these women would go on to support or advocate for building community playgrounds, strict fire codes, public libraries, education for their kids, and just more on like certain policies. We also have the temperance movement. We talked about the temperance movement before, how women believed that it was a moral duty to eliminate alcohol abuse and to strengthen the stability of families. Talked about how women back then, or during this time, also believed that if men drank more alcohol, they would be more abusive, and that would cause a very negative environment for not only them, but for their children. So in 1918, the temperance movement was actually successful, as the 18th Amendment outlawed liquor. Obviously this wasn't really, I would say, successful, because it's really hard to implement, or really hard to implement this amendment, as it's very hard to just outlaw all forms of liquor. And we'll talk about how this soon led to a rise of like crime rates, and there are people who smuggled in liquor. We also have expansion of suffrage. So people who were really important in this cause, it was Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul. They were leaders. They organized many of the public marches, rallies, and protests. And this soon served successful, as in August 18th, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. The 19th Amendment said that, states, or just or United States, cannot infringe on the right to vote whether, it cannot be based or discriminate against a person that is based on their gender, race, or sex, or just like anything. And that if you were an American citizen, or if you were a United States citizen, you had the right to vote. We also have what I say is this continuity, as women still lacked significant political influences and remained absent from certain career fields. And African American women were still, discriminated against, and they were still seen in this inferior position in society when compared to the white women, or who, had certain privileges that African American women still didn't have. So that's something really important to remember. Certain races of women were still like stuck in this position that they couldn't really advance in society. Sophie, you have a question?
I forgot to, unraise my hand.
Oh, okay. It's fine. I'll lower it. Yeah. Someone asked if the world wars was during this time. Yeah, they do happen in period 7. So these are two pictures, very famous pictures. On the left, we have this flag of a women's club where, women gather, talk about issues that are really important. Right, the idea of women's suffrage, voting for women and equality. This time, the progressive era is also marked by, 3 really important presidents during this time. The first one being Theodore Roosevelt. He was a dynamic president, and at the age of 42, Roosevelt became the youngest president during that time. He was a major voice of the progressive movement, as he did a lot of reform, especially his really famous domestic program called the Square Deal. That's to the right. That's a picture of Theodore Roosevelt. So the Square Deal, his domestic kind of program, focused on what he called the 3 C's: conservation, control of corporation, and consumer protection. So mostly this kind of control in corporations, we see what was before, an idea that was very emphasized by the progressive and also the populist party. So he tacked a lot of trust and monopolies. He passed the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which forbade unreasonable combinations, and I quote, "in restraint of trade and commerce." So while this kind of did break a lot of monopolies and trust, it also harmed many labor unions because they were organizing in restraint of trade and commerce. So this kind of negatively affected many labor unions that, aimed to protect certain laborers or certain Americans from the harsh conditions of these corporations, of these monopolies. But although the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was unsuccessful, he also broke up many railroad companies, through a lot of court cases. The Supreme Court took an active role in this as well, as they, dissolved many companies, as Theodore Roosevelt really fought for the idea of how, you can't have monopolies, that it would be really it wouldn't be beneficial to certain farmers or certain Americans. He also focused a lot on consumer protection. So influenced by Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, Roosevelt supported the Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drug Act. So I think Upton Sinclair's The Jungle is, I guess, really revolutionary, as Sinclair described, the really unsanitary conditions in the meat packing industry, right? And meat packing industry is obviously very important, as many Americans during this time had meat in their diet. So it talks about it was really unsanitary. And because of this, Roosevelt also made many more laws and many more kind of acts to bring a new standard of sanitation to food, to medicine, just to drugs, and to just improve sanitary conditions in general. We also have what was a really important part of, the square deal, which is the environmental conservation. Then there's time, because of the Industrial Revolution and because of just industrialization in general, there's a lot of deforestation, depletion of natural resources, a lot of things that were negatively harming the environment. And in 1891, he passed a really important act, the Fourth Reserve Act, which preserved 45 million acres of timberland. 1872 established the Yellowstone National Park. 1890, the Yosemite National Park. In 1934, Roosevelt also worked with conservationists Guilford Pinchot to turn what is called the Hetchy Valley to a lot of dams, reservoirs, aqueducts that provided water to San Francisco. It still provides San Francisco with, I think, about 80% of their water. So it's still very, very important today. And then obviously Roosevelt did much more than this, but I couldn't really fit this in a slide. You just need to know that Roosevelt was an environmentalist and he really supported environmental conservation. After Roosevelt's presidency, we had the, appointment of William Howard Taft to be president. So Roosevelt picked Taft, he handpicked Taft as his successor. So obviously, many people who supported Roosevelt, which was very popular, they would vote for Taft. But the thing was, he was very inept at expanding Roosevelt's domestic policies. So he alienated many of Roosevelt's progressive supporters. So Taft wasn't really the best person to expand much of the environmental policies that Roosevelt made, or many of the policies regarding, protecting consumerism, protecting control of, or having control of corporations. Well, Taft did, have some, cases or some court cases where he did dissolve certain trust monopolies. His inability to expand many of Roosevelt's programs usually overshadowed those successful breakings of trust. Taft also focused more on foreign policy, specifically in Latin America, Asia, in Europe, rather than much of America's domestic program. And we'll learn more about that when we talk about, the start of the wars, or just American exceptionalism in the rest of period 7. After Taft, we have the appointment of Woodrow Wilson to president. So the Democrats nominated Woodrow Wilson, and he would be the first Democrat to win, the presidency, win the election since the Civil War. And that's obviously crazy because you consider how many Republicans or many progressive presidents, dominated that period. He, quoted what was called, he mentioned a lot, what was called the triple wall of privilege, in which he wanted to improve policies regarding tariffs, banks, and trust. Particularly, Wilson did a lot on tariffs, where he lowered the tariff rate about 8 to 10%. And this is very substantial, considering Roosevelt didn't really focus a lot on tariffs. So this is something that's very new. Obviously aided in his presidency. He also passed the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which created a system of 12 district banks coordinated by the new Federal Reserve Board. And this allowed him to control credit. So the Federal Reserve Board could now control credit and the supply of money. They also now have the power to raise or lower interest and issue paper currency. And this just kept everything more organized under the Federal Reserve Board. We also have the passing of the Clinton Antitrust Act of 1914. This strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act, which wasn't really that successful. Clinton Antitrust Act did something that the Sherman Antitrust Act really failed at, which was accept labor unions from antitrust protection. It protected also price discrimination and forbid the same directorates from working at different companies. So, this really prevented this idea of like having the same person work at one company and also direct another company, which meant that, those companies were interconnected, kind of linked, and they could work together. But what Woodrow Wilson is kind of like regarding his reforms, very known for, is also kind of the racial discrimination during his presidency. He kind of sat still through many of the Jim Crow sanctions. He sat still during this time of segregation, followed by what the Supreme Court said, the separate but equal clause or claim, the Plessy versus Ferguson, I guess, decision. It was also very interesting, the first president to allow a movie to be played in the White House. And the movie that was played was A Birth of a Nation. And this movie basically glorified white supremacy, the KKK, very racist. That's something like very interesting to know about Woodrow Wilson. While he did a lot of domestic programs and reforms, he didn't really help a lot. Many of the African Americans during this time were just minorities. Picture Woodrow Wilson, and picture next Woodrow Wilson and Howard Taft, or William Howard Taft. And yes, he is very known for, he's very known for, like, as the president during World War One. Sophie asked, were there Jim Crow laws? Yes, there were still Jim Crow laws that promote segregation. Johan asked, are we going to talk about the Great Depression? Yes, we will be talking about the Great Depression after World War One. But I don't think we're going to get to World War One today, considering the time, because we still have other things to talk about. So we've finally come to the section of America turning, or America becoming a world power. So this kind of section of period 7 lasts from around 1890 to 1919. Obviously, I think everyone knows that date, this 1919 date. Relates to obviously World War One. So we're gonna go back to these terms of manifest destiny and imperialism. Does anyone want to participate? Just like ask, what manifest destiny was, since we learned it last class, and what is an example of, I guess, America implementing manifest destiny in their policies. Is it Dana or Dana?
It's Dana.
Dana. Yep, sorry.
So, manifest destiny was basically the thought of that since America already owned the East, they should also own the West.
Mm-hmm.
And they thought that they had to get all the land to the West Coast because it was theirs by right, because it was rightfully theirs.
Yeah. Can you give an example of, like, I guess, a certain community that was really negatively affected by manifest destiny?
The Native Americans.
Right. That is very true. Yeah. So, thank you. So we have, this history of America trying to expand, or trying to go westward, or just trying to expand their land in general. So we see the same in America's imperialist or policies or policies towards imperialism. So many expansionists now embraced this term, the white man's burden, as the justification for imperialism. So the white man's burden, basically this term saying, certain countries or just certain people, need our help because, they're uncivilized, they're not educated, they're not Christian, they need to be Christianized, they're not religious, or their religion is wrong, or it's like savage. It's like, certain things that America justified, saying that, these countries needed America's help. We also have the same idea between manifest destiny and imperialism, in which America took possession of densely populated land with inhabitants that already had their own culture and ethnic background. But many Americans at this time obviously didn't take this into consideration. So imperialism, was the idea of manifest destiny, caused a lot of things like the war with Mexico, what we talked about, you know, the annexation of Texas, just war with Spain, which we're going to talk about later, in which they got, you know, new territories and resources. So first, we want to talk about the Spanish-American War. So during this time, Cuban rebels waged war against Spain, and you know, many American journalists, you know, used what was called yellow journalism. And so, yellow journalism was this very, I guess, promoted kind of like method of journalism where many journalists sensationalized stories. You know, they really glorified stories, they exaggerated stories that describe violence, atrocities committed by the Spanish. Another really big cause of why America went to war with Spanish was the fact that America had a ship, the USS Maine, that exploded in Havana Harbor on a visit of friendly courtesy. So the exact timeline started like this. So the USS Maine arrived in Havana Harbor, and then 3 weeks later, there was just this unexpected explosion and blast, and this caused, you know, the sinking of the ship. 260 sailors were killed due to yellow journalism and this idea of like sensationalizing or exaggerating stories. Many journalists blamed the Spanish, and this caused many Americans to blame the Spanish, despite not really knowing who actually caused the blast or who actually caused the explosion. That was the main factor as in why America decided to declare war against the Spanish. One, they saw how Cuban rebels were really experiencing a lot of this violence, and America thought that it was their burden, or the white man's burden, to help these Cuban people for, you know, just like to prevent them from more violence. So America did end up going to war with Spain, and America won what was called the Splendid Little War, and that's what like the Spanish-American War is very like, it's kind of a saying, or what the Spanish-American War is like known. It was a splendid little war because it only lasted 114 days, and America received very few casualties. So there are obviously many consequences to America winning the war. So here is kind of I guess 2 newspaper headlines implementing this idea of like yellow journalism. We see, you know, on the left, the destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. That's very bold. That's the first thing you see, and it's we see, I guess, these claims that the ship Maine, the warship Maine, was done on purpose, without any actual evidence. We see on the right, or the bottom right, history, remember the Maine on February 15th, 1898, and how it was destroyed in Havana Harbor. So like these things, you know, these news stories were just blasted on all these newspapers, which caused, you know, America, or many Americans, to support the Spanish-American War. So there are many consequences. We see, one, the emergence of the United States as a world power, because they won a war against Spain. They won a war against Spain, which is, which was once considered as this huge world power during this time, right? We can go back to Spanish and see like how like they discovered many of much of the land that was in North America and South America. So like they were once a really big world power, and this just, you know, put United States as that position. We also have the Treaty of Paris, where Spain ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States, so we got that land. Philippines was also bought for $20 million, and that we see, you know, America's first overseas territory, you know, Puerto Rico, Guam, Philippines. And this would be really important because, you know, this gave America access to Asian countries, which also meant Asian trade routes, especially trade routes to China. You know, there were a lot of economic benefits they could that could be made by establishing connections and relationships with China. We also have the passing of the Teller Amendment. Teller Amendment basically, respected Cuban independence, but American troops were still stationed there, which meant that America was still keeping a watch at Cuba. In 1901, the Platt Amendment was passed, and America said, we'll withdraw our troops, but you need to agree to these other kind of rules or policies. One, giving U.S. a naval station in Guantanamo Bay. We still have it right now. Prohibiting Cuba or prohibiting them from making treaties that might impair its independence. Basically, having control of deciding whether or not Cuba could create treaties, whether it's economic, whether it's political, with other countries. So it gave America another part of Cuba. And also the Platt Amendment just basically gave legal grounds for America to intervene in Cuba whenever they want, under the justification that, Cuba might be doing something that might impair its independence. So we have this idea of the Philippines, since we bought it for $20 million. So America's involvement with the Philippines was very shaky, as there were many debates considering whether or not America should get involved, because many believe that the Philippines already had their own, their own ethnic background, or they had their own religion, they had their own community, so there wasn't really a need to kind of intervene with their government or the people. But President McKinley said no, he wanted to Christianize them, despite the fact that they're already Catholic, as well as educate many Filipinos and just uplift many Filipinos. And the Senate approved this, so this began kind of America's relationship with the Philippines, and American troops stationed there, just like American officials stationed there as well. So really important figure. Emilio Aguinaldo resisted American intervention, and after 3 years of fighting, America finally crushed the rebels, and this obviously strengthened America's rule in the Philippines. So in 1916, the United States actually granted Philippines their independence from Spain and just their independence in general, but this didn't stop the stationing of troops or the sanctions of U.S. officials, or just like people or the United States just using the Philippines for economic benefits, political benefits, or using them to have access to certain Asian countries. It wouldn't be until July 5th, 1946, where the Philippines actually received their full independence from, America. So we see this kind of those harsh times in which, Philippines, after, having gone through the Spanish-American War, and then having been bought by the United States, while, under the guise of they're going to receive their independence, weren't actually independent until 30 years. So that's a very interesting relationship with the Philippines. Since time is almost up, we won't be starting on the World War I, this lesson, but the World War's next lesson. So we're going to end this from today, this idea of, starting of America's exceptionalism, imperialism. Does anyone have any questions or interesting things they learned today? So when asked what was the KKK, we talked about the KKK last week. Basically, it stands for the Ku Klux Klan, and they were a community or a group of usually white Americans that promoted violence, discrimination against African Americans or the certain minorities, and they just promoted a lot of violence, and they incited a lot of violence as well. Does anyone else have any questions or want to, share with what they learned that was very interesting today? If there are no questions, the class can end here. You are free to leave. Obviously, if you have any questions, you know, always post in the Google Classroom or email. My email, it will be in the Google Classroom as well. I'm going to post the slides here too.